This is a conversation with Ronan Bergman. Ronan is a journalist at the New York Times, based in Israel, and an author of a unique book called Rise and Kill First, about the history and practice of the Israeli program of state-sponsored targeted assassinations. Ronan spent years working on this research, digging into stuff that's almost entirely classified, and speaking to dozens of members of the Israeli intelligence, government, and military. He managed to get a level of access that is completely unprecedented, and that's despite the fact that the Israeli government and intelligence services tried to do everything they could to stop him from doing that. In this conversation, we talk about how do you research something that's almost entirely classified, about where does the Israeli practice of state-sponsored assassinations originate, why does Israel use it more than almost any other nation, or how do people who plan and carry out these operations think about it, and about when did these kinds of operations literally rewrote history, or whether in the end they're actually making Israel safer or not really. And we also talk about the ethics and morals of all of this, because I don't want to be glorifying it, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to Ronan is because I know that he doesn't do that either. He's an Israeli citizen who's also very critical to what his own country does, and I think that he manages to stay objective and critically analyze and evaluate what his own country does. The corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. It's also supported by generous and amazing supporters on Patreon, to whom I'm deeply grateful and who make the existence of this podcast possible. And you can join them to access full ad-free episodes and a bunch of other perks. And if you want to get regular, free geopolitical analysis, you can sign up to my newsletter, Station Zero. You can find the link in the description. And now, enjoy the conversation. Okay, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So we're going to be talking about the topic of your book, Rise and Kill First, which is about a pretty unique topic of the history and practice of the Israeli practice of basically targeted killings or state-sponsored assassinations. And you dedicated many years of research and investigation, so you'd be able to write a book about it. And it is a pretty particular topic. So what initially inspired you to get into it and to write a book about it and dedicate so much time to that? And why do you think that it's particularly important?
Israel is unique because in the time frames between the wars, Israel was engaged in low-intensity conflicts from that kind or the other. And the use of targeted killing or targeted assassination, or you can call them, there are many, there's a vast vocabulary that can be attributed to the act. An act that has become more and more central to the fight of the world against terrorism, more controversial as more countries has started to use that. But Israel has been using that for the from its first day of existence, basically. And that tool has become, in many cases, and we have, I think, saw this very, very clearly flashed out in the last few months of the war with the, I would say, not just Israel with Gaza, but the Middle East war, the centrality of targeted killings, of targeted assassinations, and basically saying that, first of all, it is legitimate by a state to execute what in most criminal codes is the most severe crime. And by doing the most severe crime, the state is executing an act of self-defense and making reality better. That's the assumption. And that you can save, that's the claim, which I'm trying to discuss throughout Rise and Kill First, which is rightly said, it took 8 years of research and writing. This is the question: is it legitimate? Is it fruitful? Does the world become a better place? And looking at the Israeli experience was, at the beginning of the research, was, I thought, a combination between unbelievable intelligence and operational stories. We are looking as journalists, as historians, at these. Looking at acts that change history, looking at the question that has been more and more occupying the world. But as the research continued, the book turned to something very different. This is basically the history of Israel, the history of the region, is basically seen. It's the history of Israeli intelligence, which is the history of Israel, which is the history of the region. And basically, I think, at the end, it turned out to be the history of the Middle East and Israel in the last 100 years, until the book was sent to print in some years ago. And I think it looked at that history from a unique point of view that is usually neglected because of lack of resources, lack of visibility, lack of reach, the point of view of the spies. And in Israel, there is no major historical event, not major historical trend. There's no major historical blunder. Sometimes the Jewish James Bond look more like Inspector Clouseau. But for good and for bad, it was always the intelligence and special operations were always part. I call them once the shadow cover of history. And here, I was hoping you'll tell me you read the book. I hope and here I was able to tell the story from that point of view, and because this point of view was never told, it reveals so many things. You cannot understand the history of the Second World War if you don't know that the Brits decrypted the secrets of the Enigma, the first computer that was embedded in Bletchley Park. You can speak about the Second World War, but without that, the history is just incomplete. And so in order to have a correct read of Israel history, you need to know the history of its spies and how they got involved and how they contributed, for good and for bad, to the shaping of the general history.
So basically, you've hinted that one of the reasons why it maybe hasn't gotten as much attention before was because of the lack of access. And basically, almost everything that you write about the book is classified. And you even mentioned about how the Israeli state and Mossad specifically tried to ensure that it will stay classified and that they wouldn't want you to get the access and write the book and make it public. So how do you, as a journalist and a researcher, how do you actually write a book about a topic that is mostly classified and that people want to stay secret? And how do you get people to tell you information that they probably shouldn't be telling you? And many or some people in the book do that on their own name, not just anonymously. So how do you actually do all that?
And I just add to the obstacles that, according to the Israeli law, what was the law until I petitioned against the law, it was 50 years for declassification of documents on national security. And then I petitioned. It started already in 2008, the documents that are 50 years older, so 48, the establishment of Israel, 2008. Then I told them they needed to start declassification of the old documents. And so the state, when it turns out that the state is violating the law, the state is just changing the law. So they went to court and they said, yeah, that's fine. And we're changing it to 17 years. And when I exited the Supreme Court in that petition that appeared, I met with one of the leaders of Israeli intelligence that time. And he said, Bergman, don't worry. You will never get your hands on these documents because when Israel turned 70, we will prolong it to 100. Now, he was wrong because when Israel turned 70, Benjamin Netanyahu prolonged it to 90 years. So officially, there was no way to get any of these documents. They were all classified. And then you go into a massive work that took 8 years of running sources or speaking with sources that 100% of them were speaking with me without approval, without confirmation, without a pre-consent of the Israeli administration, which is a big problem. Some of them, luckily for me, forgot in their possession documents upon retiring and shared these documents with me. And at the end, we ended up with a list of 1,000 interviewees. Many of them, as you say, on the record, speaking with their name. That I think it created, when the book was published, there was a big havoc about this. I think it created such a massive throve that nobody even thought to start indicting any of them. It was everybody, the prime minister, minister of defense, the chiefs of Mossad, the chiefs of the military. What could they do? And it was a very, very long work with of course, having in the back of my mind that most of these people, or many of these people, are intelligence officers. They are case officers. Their art is to manipulate people and recruit. So how do you case officing the case officer? Or I would say, how do you make sure that he doesn't manipulate you? Because, there's a big question. I come from the history faculty of Cambridge University. There's a long discussion on the use of oral sources. So again, I was fortunate. Many people cooperated. Some were hesitant. In some cases, I did to them the one thing that makes Israelis more ballistic than anything else. I coincidentally, during the meeting, told them that someone else took credit for their operation. That usually, he tells you that he was in Damascus? Now I will tell you the whole truth. And, people are people, humans are humans, even if they are Mossad spies or Israeli intelligence officials. And at the end, I hope that we were able to create, together with Yael de Ben Sasson, who helped me a lot with this research, we were able to create a trove of data, a trove of reporting that had enough corroboration and cross references between written documents and oral sources. So we were able to vet much, if not all, the information. And if not, I was trying to identify, this is something I don't know. One of the former chiefs of Mossad, he said, Ronan, I don't know how you make a call. I have Mossad operatives that came from beyond enemy lines, behind enemy lines, that come to my office, and not of bad intent, but few days after an operation, each one is telling different story. Like Korasa was Rashomon. So how do you make a call? And it is, especially if it's like 10 years after, 20 years after, it is a job. It's a specific work that needs to be done very carefully. And I think is the vast majority of cases we got it right.
So, if there's not enough space in this podcast to talk about the entire book, but to pick a few things out of it, one thing that I found really interesting was that basically the strategy and practice of using targeted assassinations as a tool was a thing even before the establishment of the state of Israel officially in 1948, and that you had Jewish militias like the Haganah that were already basically waging a war of terror, you could say, and practicing that or using that strategy by targeting British officers and officials who were in charge of the Palestinian Mandate before 1948. So, and I guess that was maybe the beginning of this. What was the strategic rationale back then, before Israel even came to exist, behind these early operations?
Um, you know, it's interesting that one of the leaders of the more extreme groups of underground resistance to the Brits and the with the hope to forcibly expel the British mandate out of Palestine, as it was called then, Menachem Begin, the head of Etzel, Irgun Tzvai Leumi, the national military organization, he called assassinations, he called them personal terror. I think that nowadays, if the U.S. Using a drone to kill a Taliban or Al Qaeda or ISIS leader, I don't think that anyone would call it a personal terror. The definition of terrorism has become euphemism for something very bad. So I think it's a different thing. Now, I think there are two things here. First of all, some of the resistance or underground or terrorists, whatever you call them, organizations, thought that by targeting specific British civil servants, members of the British Mandate, the SOE, the Special Operation Executive, or the police, or they will be able to just make it sort of frustrating for the Brits to continue ruling Palestine and just make them at the end say, like, just take it away from me. And to an extent, it did have an effect on what Britain has decided at the end, which is to leave Palestine and say, give it to them. The second thing was the news that came from Europe after 1945. That has changed everything. The Holocaust, that according to the belief of the people who lived in Palestine, would not be affecting so many people if there was a country for the Jews beforehand, and that they need to use the Holocaust to create a refuge, a national refuge for the Jews. That need that is hovering as a sort of an arc narrative above everything that happened after 1945 until today, that loosen the restrictions that the leaders of what we call the Yeshuv, the Jewish community in Israel, back then, before the establishment of Israel, I think that under that necessity, they allowed themselves to do more, and it leads to the third point, which is the war of independence, the 1948 war. They knew that they are going to be a small, very small force against 7 Arab forces or armies, far less funded, far less equipped, and they wanted to use a targeted force to achieve targeted goal, especially against the civil war inside Israel between the Palestinians and the Jews. As it goes, the spirit was there. The idea of targeting a specific person to have a much broader effect on history was there. The ability was not so much there, because it's very hard to target someone specific. But it's clear that the spirit that was interpreted as, in many cases, I would say, violating international law, since Israel was established and was really unacceptable until 9/11 by most of the countries in the world. That spirit stayed, and it stayed because the Jews that came, my parents, who came from Europe as Holocaust survivors after the war, and the Jews that were in Israel and sort of absorbed that spirit, I think that what they find, the three lessons from the Holocaust, is that there will always be someone who's after us to kill us. The rest are not going to do anything to help in the better situation, and that the Jews must have a safe haven, a refuge, a country, a state, a strong state that would stand erect on its sword in order to make sure this will never happen again. Now, when you have this in the back of your mind, and every generation, every decade in the history of Israel, you have a foe, you have an enemy, you have a nemesis that is saying, I want to destroy the state of Israel and kill the Jews. Then you come back, your conclusion is to attribute less importance to international law and more important to that phrase from the Talmud. Whoever comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. And this is why Israel practiced that tool, that weapon, more than any other country in the world, at least in the Western world, since Second World War. And I think to an extent, use that to change history. Just think of what happened in the history of the Middle East since the explosion of the pagers and the killing of Nasrallah. It changed all.
If you're enjoying this podcast, chances are that you like to know what's going on in the world of geopolitics. And if that's the case, you might want to sign up to my newsletter. There's a lot of news on geopolitics, but most of it just doesn't actually matter. It's just chasing headlines, emotions, and breaking news. What I want to do is to try to separate all this noise and find the signal, the stuff that actually does matter and will have consequences months and years down the line. And so in every edition, I pick out 3 things that do matter and explain why and what will be their future impact. You can find the link in the description, so check it out and sign up to stay informed. There's probably way too many, or there's probably not enough time on this podcast to talk about the entire history, and there's probably way too many operations that you cover in the book to talk about all of them. But if I would ask you, if in your view, you would, if you look at the history since the establishment of Israel until basically everything prior to October 7th, are there any operations that you would pick out as the ones that you think had the most profound impact on Israel's security or geopolitical situation, or that were that fundamental in the way that were carried out?
To answer all your questions, we need the podcast that would last many, many hours. But maybe if I can identify few that each one maybe characterize something. The story, so basically Israel has tried and killed 3 kinds of targets. Leaders of countries or infrastructure or organizations, people, scientists, or traders involved in the making of non-conventional warfare, especially nuclear, something that Israel sees as an existential threat. and people connected to terrorism. And just to say a few words about each of the categories, I think that the first one, leaders, are by far the smallest group. First of all, because they are leaders, they're few. Second, because they're well protected, usually. Third, because Israel, in many, many cases, thought that it's not wise to kill a foreign leader because then it legitimizes killing Israeli leaders. But fourth, more than anything else, I think that there's a long debate between historians. What shapes history? Is it people? Is it big social or economic trends? Are there organizations? Is it politics? Is it economy? It's a long debate. But it turns out that, and these, you can ask the counterfactual history question. Let's say, what would happen if von Stauffenberg would put the bang with the explosive in the other side of that leg of that table and kill Adolf Hitler? Would that change history? Probably yes. What would happen if Yigal Amir in November 1995 would miss and not kill Yitzhak Rabin? What would happen to the peace process? But in the cases that it did kill leaders, some of them specified in details in the book, it turns out that history does change, but not necessarily in the direction that Israel expected. In 1992, in February 1992, Israel, in the first assassination or targeted killing with the use of a drone. That case was only a drone with a laser marker for a missile sent from helicopter, killed the Secretary General of the Hezbollah, Abbas Moussawi. And Israel was hoping that this will deter Hezbollah, will follow Hezbollah to release the Israeli hostage, and then also to make the organization more moderate. And but instead, what happened is that they appointed a person that I'm not sure how many people in Israel heard of. He was 31 years old at that time. And he made Hezbollah into the most important enemy of Israel, the strongest, a strategic threat to the country of the Jews. That's Hassan Nasrallah, that Israel used targeted killing to used 84 tons of bombs to kill at the end of last year. So it shapes history. The other kind are proliferators, scientists that are dealing with missiles or projects of weapon of mass destruction. And all the stories have a lot of sadness and death and blood. But if you are looking for one of the stories that are of the most, I would say, earthquaking moments in the history of Mossad, it's about a group of scientists, German scientists who used to work with Pindamunda when they produced the V1 and V2 that later were rained on and destroyed some parts of London. And in the peak of a story where these German scientists were recruited by NASA to produce a fleet of missiles, surface-to-surface long-range ballistic missile with which NASA said he will destroy the state of the Jews. He will destroy any target south of Beirut. And you can look at the map and see what is the south of Beirut. At the peak of that, Israel recruited the chief of special operations for Hitler, an avid Nazi, Otto Skorzeny, something that nobody could think of. I don't want to scoop myself. It's all in chapter 5. But Israel was able to recruit him while he knew that he's working for Mossad, and became the most valuable asset in that time and solved the most important national security threat to Israel. And how this was done, and how is this connected to his style of life of open marriage? I leave the listeners to read themselves. But the third kind of people that Israel assassinated is a group of many, many, many thousands, and these are people connected to terrorism. And I think if there's a moment, one operation, I think, at least until the last war, it's the cooperation between Israeli intelligence, both A200, the equivalent to the NSA and Mossad, and the CIA and the NSA, to follow the person who Israel nicknamed Wild Child, and the Americans nicknamed No Name. You remember, like Voldemort of Harry Potter, the one that we don't even say his name. The most wanted terrorism at that time, it was February 2008, where after a more than a year-long operation, following decades of manhunt worldwide, the biggest manhunt ever conducted in the history of mankind, Israel and the US were able to kill the military commander of Hezbollah, Imad Monier, in what I think maybe was the most complicated and sophisticated operation ever conducted, which also had a lot of outcomes and reflections. And I think that operation proved that there is no one, even the most strict ghost that is, keeping totally off the grid, there's no one. If a country like Israel or a country like the US invest enough resources, there is no one who is totally immune. There is no one that cannot be killed.
You've mentioned that Israel is not the only country carrying out these operations, and even it seems to me that actually it's more and more countries conducting these kinds of operations, and it's conducting more of them in recent decades. But you've mentioned that Israel was probably the first country maybe to start using them at such an extent and in such large numbers. Do you think that there are other ways in which the way Israel approaches these kinds of operations or thinks about them or conducts them that is significantly different to how other countries that also carry out targeted killings do it?
I'm not sure I understand the question, but if I understand, I try to address it. Look, the CIA senior official once asked me, when we discussed what is there that is different in the DNA in Israeli intelligence, and I think we both agree that it's not a secret cyber vulnerability that someone is using or secret technology or a weapon, but it's the added thought that the employees of Israeli intelligence are carrying with them to work every day. Now, we are talking about after the October 7 blunder, so we also need to bear that in mind. But I think that even having this in mind, there's an extra thought that basically says to them every day, of course, everyone wants to have a career and wants to have a fulfillment, wants to earn a little money, wants to do interesting stuff. But I think that there's an added thought or added concern that the employees of Israeli intelligence are carried with them. And that is like in the opening sequence of Star Trek, space is the final frontier. They are the front line. They are the final frontier to protect the Israeli citizens from being harmed and protect the country from being destroyed. And because everything is seen as sort of existential threat, not always right, that they are very much motivated to do everything they can. Now, if you go to and check the targets of many intelligence services in the West, you'll see that their target is to bring information from behind enemy lines, to help the decision-making process of the leaders. But for Israeli intelligence, this is just the beginning, because they are also in charge, usually, of disrupting. So first understanding what the enemy is planning, but also working like actively, kinetically, as they say, behind the enemy line to assassinate, to disrupt, to sabotage, to cyber penetrate, but to stop the enemy from acting and doing what the enemy is planning. It's not just just obtaining the information, but it's translation of the intelligence into operations way behind enemy line. And that changes everything. It means something very, very different, and the responsibility is very different.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. I want to talk about the ethical side of it as well. And you've mentioned the mindset of the existential danger and the Holocaust experience that forms the way that Israeli government and the people who work there who make these decisions think about it. But still, you write in the book about a number of instances where it was at least considered to carry out operations that would be very ethically wrong, I think, or morally wrong. How did you personally sort of thought about all that? How did you approach the ethical dimension when researching and writing about this topic? And how do people that you've met and interacted and talked with, how do they think about it? Or do they actually think about the ethical side of it that much? Or is it just a given that's just a job, it's part of it, that's how it goes?
Yeah, well, this is a very general, Dominic, very general questions. And of course, the question is, which case are we discussing? But I think that it's clear from the book that in some cases, the collateral damage and whether is it justified to kill a person, so to sort of issue a death verdict with court that the accused is not even aware that exists, with no real evidence, no prosecutor, no lawyer to defend, no real judge, but a judgment that this person deserves to die. And then the more, I think, more difficult question is whether, while killing that person, if he was found to be a bad guy that is to be killed, whether to risk the lives of innocent civilians around him. And these are very, very, very difficult, diabolic questions. There were many, many places during the research and after that where I really thought, how would I feel? What would I decide? And it's very difficult. I thought to myself, I'm lucky I don't need to make such calls. But I think that if the book also tells the stories of people that I see as real heroes, though it's not the heroism in the battlefield. These are like, you have many, many, many cases of these in the book. But people who thought that this is morally, ethically, legally wrong, something to do, and stood firm to push back on their colleagues and their commanders. And I think this is a much, to an extent, much bigger bravery than the bravery in the battlefield. So the case where the Supreme Command of the Air Force rebelled against the Ministry of Defense, Ariel Sharon, and sabotaged the operation that he ordered Ariel Sharon to take down a commercial airline with hundreds of people on board in order to disguise the killing of Arafat, the leader of the PLO that was there. Or that young, these are senior commanders, or that young officer in 8200 Israeli signal intelligence agency that thought that they decided, the chiefs of the military decided to attack a PLO, a Fatah site, not in order to kill a certain person who is involved in terrorism, but in order to kill a person, someone, to deter. And he said, listen, this is wrong. This is illegal. And in spite of being threatened that he would be court-martialed, that he is a traitor, he stood firm and said, no, I will not supply the intelligence to this operation. He saved the life of people. He was right, legally, ethically, morally, and they talk about the purification of arms to keep the arm of the IDF pure. I think he helped very much to keep the arms of the IDF pure. He paid a personal price, but he was a real hero.
Yeah. It was largely the plan to shoot down the commercial airliner that I was referring to. But I think another big question, apart from the question of whether it's ethical, is another one that you've already also hinted at, and that's whether these operations to assassinate these targets are actually effective. If at the end of the day, they're not just effective tactically, that they manage to successfully eliminate the target, but whether they're in the long term, they're able to actually achieve Israel's broader geopolitical goals, and whether they're able to make it in the long term safer or not. And you've mentioned that in some cases you can't really foresee the long-term consequences of what's going to happen and whether you're actually going to make it better or worse by doing that. So what's your view on this question? Do you think that in the long term, the using of this tool, and how much is it being used, do you think that it's a net positive in terms of efficiency? Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.